The sea looked like shattered glass beneath a sky of iron. December 1944, the North Sea breathed frost and fear. From horizon to horizon, ships crawled across the gray water in tight formation, each one weighed down with the lifeblood of an army. Hundreds of liberty ships, tankers and freighters. A city in motion, pushing east against waves that wanted to break them, and winds that wanted to bury them. Their decks were slick with ice, their men hollow-eyed from nights that never ended. Each heartbeat of the engine meant one more breath for a soldier somewhere in Belgium, one more shell fired, one more day survived. In the thin morning light, the sea didn't roar, it whispered. The ships creaked under the strain, steel complaining against cold. White frost clung to every railing, every rope, even the eyelashes of the men on watch. Somewhere inside the haze of salt and diesel, a single escort destroyer cut ahead of the column, a wolf guarding sheep made of metal. Beneath the waterline, invisible predators waited. 20 U-boats had been sighted in the last week. Somewhere down there, diesel engines purred and torpedoes dreamed of impact. A sailor on the bridge of the John M. Clayton lifted his binoculars and saw nothing but ghosts of smoke and waves. He knew that somewhere beyond the mist, German eyes watched through periscopes, patient and precise. They were fighting a war of silence, and silence could kill as surely as fire. Above him, gulls circled, the only creatures that dared move freely here. They screamed into the wind, their cries vanishing against the thunder of distant waves. The convoy stretched for miles, tankers carrying fuel for Patton's tanks, refrigerated ships stacked with crates of bread and meat, freighters heavy with ammunition and winter coats. Every crate was a promise: warmth, survival, victory. The ships had names like Endeavor, Fortitude, Faith, words chosen to defy the ocean itself. But beneath their defiance was fragility. One torpedo could end 1,000 meals. One wave could claim an entire crew. When the sun rose, it didn't bring comfort. It only revealed how small they were. Light fell over the decks, gilding the frost in gold, turning the gray sea into liquid fire. Men paused to watch, their faces pale beneath wool caps. It was beautiful, too beautiful. In beauty there was danger, because on the far edge of that light, the sea rippled unnaturally. A shape, long, low, fast, slipped beneath the surface. A periscope blinked in the dawn. The destroyer's alarm shattered the calm. Engines surged, guns swung toward the horizon. Depth charges rolled off the stern, their metal skins glinting for a moment before vanishing into the sea. Seconds later, the ocean erupted, plumes of water and smoke rising like geysers. The convoy tightened its line, ships steering in desperate choreography. To stop was to die. To slow down was to invite the torpedo's kiss. And yet, even in chaos, the system held. Orders moved down the chain, cold, efficient, impersonal. Maintain speed. Hold formation. Protect the lifeline. Men obeyed because they believed in something larger than survival. They believed in purpose. Behind them, across hundreds of miles, 1 million soldiers depended on the rhythm of their engines. Food, fuel, ammunition. It all flowed through them, an iron artery keeping the Allied heart alive. By midday, the attack had faded. No ships lost. Not today. The ocean smoothed again, pretending innocence. The men returned to their posts, soaked, trembling, wordless. Steam rose from the deck as the sun climbed higher, revealing scars, twisted metal where shrapnel had grazed, a torn flag still clinging to its mast. They'd survived another morning, and that felt like a miracle. Somewhere below deck, a young radio operator scribbled a note in his journal. "We feed the war, but the sea wants its share." His words bled through the page with the ship's vibration. Above him, the convoy pushed forward, endless and alive, defying logic, defying odds. Every man at the front, from the frozen foxholes of Bastogne to the muddy tracks of Holland, would eat because this convoy refused to sink. They would fight because these engines refused to die. The ocean had swallowed fleets before, but not this one. Not yet. The horizon shimmered, endless and uncertain. And over that wavering line came the question that would haunt every sailor on those decks. How do you feed 1,000,000 soldiers when every mile is under attack? But to understand how this floating miracle was even possible, we must start where it all began, in chaos. The beaches of Normandy were never meant to feed an army. They were meant to take one ashore, fast, brutal, temporary. But in the weeks after D-Day, the tide of men kept coming, and the shore began to choke on its own success. Mountains of crates, barrels, and boxes piled higher than the dunes themselves. Labels bled under the rain. Fuel, rations, ammunition. The sound of victory, engines roaring inland, was matched by the grinding of trucks stuck in mud, waiting for supplies that couldn't catch up. By July 1944, the Allied advance had outrun its stomach. Every tank that broke through hedgerows toward Paris did so on fumes. Every artillery battery that fired too long risked silence the next morning. The front lines were moving faster than logistics could breathe. Commanders met in tents filled with maps and tension. "We can't fight without fuel," Patton growled, slamming a fist on the table. "My tanks can win battles, but only if my quartermasters can win the roads." Behind the glamour of headlines and heroics, another army was fighting a quieter war. The logisticians, the engineers, the planners buried under paperwork and mud. They were the keepers of the invisible front. Bridges rebuilt before dawn, depots reorganized after bombing raids, columns rerouted around roads that no longer existed. Their enemy was not the Wehrmacht, but time itself. Every delay killed men who would never know their names. At night, soldiers at the front scrounged through ration tins already scraped clean. Bread went stale in the salt air. Coffee grounds were boiled twice. Some units traded cigarettes for chocolate. Some stole from nearby supply columns. It wasn't greed. It was survival. The irony cut deep. They were liberators starving on liberated land. A war built on industrial abundance was learning hunger again. And yet, in this hunger, something profound began to shift. The Allies realized that logistics wasn't the backline anymore. It was the war. Each bullet fired, each tank mile gained, was a function of tonnage delivered per day. A quiet doctrine began to take shape in field reports and whispered briefings. Logistical supremacy. Victory wouldn't belong to the army that shot first, but to the one that could keep shooting longest. At Cherbourg, engineers worked through bombed-out harbors, dragging rusted cranes back to life. In Britain, supply officers designed schedules that stretched across continents. Trains to docks, docks to ships, ships to beaches. On the ground, truck convoys formed endless chains of motion, roaring down roads marked only by chalk and courage. Each driver learned to navigate not by compass, but by instinct. Follow the dust cloud ahead. Ignore the hunger in your gut. Trust the system. Still, the system buckled under its own weight. German demolitions had shattered bridges. French railways lay in ruins. Everything had to move by truck, and trucks drank fuel faster than ships could deliver it. Logistics devoured itself. The soldiers at the front joked bitterly that every gallon of gas had to fight its way to them. The irony was cruel. The closer they got to Germany, the more fragile their lifeline became. In the planning tents, tempers flared. Montgomery demanded priority shipments for his push to the north. Patton argued for fuel to chase the retreating Germans east. Eisenhower, caught between them, saw the real enemy, the arithmetic of supply. "We can't give both what they want," he admitted. "We'll have to give each just enough to survive." The war had turned from strategy to mathematics, from courage to calculation. But even amid shortages, brilliance flickered. Young officers devised new systems to load ships faster, track convoys better, calculate losses before they happened. The science of movement was evolving in real time, born from desperation. War had forced men to become engineers, and engineers to become strategists. And through it all, the soldiers kept moving, hungry, exhausted, determined. They fought for villages, then waited days for the supplies to arrive that would let them fight again. They lived on faith, not in slogans, but in the unseen men who kept the wheels turning behind them. Those men had no medals, no parades, but without them, no flag would have risen over Paris, no convoy would have left England, and no army would have marched another mile. As August approached, the Allied lines stretched like a starving body, lean, unstoppable but dangerously thin. Every success carried the shadow of collapse. They had conquered Normandy, but now faced an enemy more relentless than any army. The physics of distance. And so the question began to echo through every command post, every supply depot, every sleepless mind. How do you feed 1,000,000 men across a continent still on fire? Out of this looming starvation came one radical plan, an idea so vast it was called impossible. He walked into the operations tent like a storm in uniform. Major General John Clifford Hodges Lee, the man who believed he could feed an entire continent with nothing but order, willpower, and mathematics. To his subordinates he was Jesus Christ himself, a nickname whispered with both awe and venom. To Eisenhower he was indispensable, a logistical zealot who treated tonnage as theology and timetables as scripture. Where others saw chaos, Lee saw geometry. Where most saw limits, he saw inefficiency. And inefficiency to him was sin. Maps stretched across the tables like battlefields of ink and string. Lines of red and blue crisscrossed Europe. Ports, depots, truck routes, pipelines. Cigarette smoke hung low, coiling around the lamps as officers argued in the dim glow. Outside, trucks rattled over the mud, the sound of a war that never slept. Inside, Lee's voice cut through the noise like a cleaver. "Gentlemen," he said, his southern accent ironed flat by command, "we will not let distance defeat us. We will build a machine so vast that even the ocean will bend to it." He had seen failure before. At Normandy, at Cherbourg, at every clogged beachhead where progress drowned beneath crates and confusion. He'd watched soldiers starve while warehouses overflowed just a few miles away. It wasn't lack of courage that threatened the Allies. It was chaos. And chaos could be engineered out of existence. Lee's doctrine was simple, ruthless, and revolutionary. Efficiency is a weapon. He believed that every soldier, every truck, every gallon of fuel was part of one living system, a body that needed rhythm, precision, and obedience. Emotion had no place in it. War is not won by heroes, he told his staff. It's won by schedules. His peers called him arrogant. They weren't wrong. He demanded respect he rarely returned. He quoted scripture in logistics meetings, framed efficiency as virtue, and treated dissent as heresy. Yet even his critics couldn't ignore the results. Under his command, the communications zone, COM-Z, began to transform from a jumble of warehouses into a living network. Railways, ports, and pipelines became veins in a single circulatory system, feeding the Allied advance. His boldest concept was something no one had dared attempt: a continuous convoy chain linking England's docks to France's ports and beyond. A self-sustaining supply organism that could move millions of tons without stopping. The idea seemed insane. The channel was still dangerous. Ports were damaged. Roads barely existed, but Lee saw it differently. To him, every obstacle was an equation waiting to be solved. He surrounded himself with minds that mirrored his own. Mathematicians turned officers, engineers with grease-stained hands, and planners who could see not just the map, but the flow within it. They worked through nights lit by oil lamps and tension. Papers rustled like restless wings. Calculations piled high. Ship tonnage, fuel consumption, turnaround times. Every number was a heartbeat in the great mechanical creature Lee was building. "Gentlemen," he said during one late-night briefing, "if we cannot move it, it may as well not exist. A bullet in a warehouse is as useless as a prayer on the wind." Around him, nods, weary, skeptical, resigned. Yet something in his conviction pulled them in. Even those who hated him found themselves believing, if only for the length of his speeches. Still, his ambition had enemies. Frontline commanders mocked him as a desk general, a man waging war with pencils while others bled. Patton loathed his formality. Montgomery despised his sanctimony. But Eisenhower, pragmatic as always, saw in Lee the one thing no one else could deliver: scale. The general didn't fight for glory, He fought for momentum. The plan took shape in layers. Convoys would leave England daily, perfectly timed to deliver fuel, food, and ammunition to French ports. From there, truck routes and temporary pipelines would push supplies deeper into Europe. The system would breathe in cycles: load, sail, unload, repeat, a tide of logistics that never rested. Every delay would ripple forward, starving men at the front. Every success would echo across battlefields they'd never see. And yet, beneath the precision, something human pulsed. Many of his officers began to wonder. Was this machine they were building meant to serve men or replace them? Could discipline alone defeat entropy? Lee never answered. His faith wasn't in men or mercy. It was in motion itself. So long as things moved, they lived. One night, as the wind rattled the canvas walls, an aide asked him quietly, "Sir, what if the sea doesn't cooperate?" Lee didn't look up from his papers. "Then we teach it discipline," he said. His pen never paused. Outside, rain hammered the tent like artillery. The channel was rising again, restless and dark, the one element no man could command. But plans on paper mean nothing when the sea decides to fight back. The sea was black glass under a bruised sky. The engines throbbed like distant drums, their rhythm the only thing holding back the silence. To the men aboard the SS Empire Halberd, every heartbeat of the propeller meant they were still alive. The convoy stretched in a long steel column across the channel, 50 ships bound for the broken ports of Normandy. Each carried a piece of the Allied war machine: gasoline, flour, ammunition, spare parts, blood plasma, hope. The sailor's name was Thomas Avery, a merchant seaman from Liverpool. He'd been at sea since the first year of the war, through torpedoes and storms, and now he found himself at the heart of Operation Pluto, the pipeline under the ocean. It wasn't just a supply run anymore. It was history in motion. Beneath the waves, coiled lines of steel and rubber snaked from the Isle of Wight to Cherbourg, feeding the invasion with liquid fire. But even the miracle of the pipeline couldn't carry everything. The convoys still had to move. The ocean still demanded its toll. Avery stood at the rail, the cold biting through his gloves. The smell of oil and salt filled his lungs. Around him, the night was a living thing, whispering, shifting, hiding its teeth. Somewhere out there, German U-boats watched them through glass lenses, calculating angles, waiting for the perfect moment. "It's the quiet ones that kill you," the boatswain said once. He was right. When the sea was calm, it was only because death was listening. The convoy crept forward in perfect formation. Destroyers flanked the column like wolves turned shepherds, their sonar pings echoing through the deep. The air smelled of diesel and fear. Orders had been drilled into them. No lights, no radio chatter, no breaks in line. If one ship fell behind, it was abandoned. The ocean could forgive nothing. At dawn, the horizon bloomed orange. The first planes appeared, tiny specks growing into the sharp silhouettes of Messerschmitts. Alarms screamed. Men ran to their stations, pulling helmets over frozen ears. The sky split open. Tracers carved red lines through the mist as anti-aircraft guns barked from every deck. The sea boiled with explosions, smoke curling like black vines into the clouds. Avery manned the winch near the stern, his hands shaking as the deck shuddered beneath him. He could smell cordite and burning paint. One of the ships ahead, a tanker named Fort Halifax, took a hit. Fire blossomed from its midsection, bright and terrible, a sun born on water. The shockwave rolled through the convoy, rattling bolts and bones alike. Through the smoke, Avery saw men in the flames, their silhouettes jerking like marionettes as they tried to leap into the sea. The order came through the signal lamp, cold, merciless. "Maintain formation. Do not stop." It went against everything human. Men screamed for help as the convoy moved on, engines droning with mechanical indifference. The destroyers dropped depth charges, their explosions muffled under the roar of the burning tanker. The ocean swallowed fire and men alike. Avery wanted to look away, but he couldn't. The rules were clear. Compassion killed convoys. One ship stopping meant 3 ships lost. This was not cruelty. It was logic. Industrial war had no room for rescue. Minutes stretched into years. The fire dimmed. The Fort Halifax sank slowly, her stern lifting in defiance before sliding beneath the waves. The convoy closed ranks, filling the gap she left behind. No one spoke. The smoke trailed behind them like a funeral banner. When night returned, it came with fog thick as grief. Men moved like ghosts through the dim red glow of the deck lamps. Coffee was passed in silence, too bitter to taste. Somewhere above, the stars were hidden, the sky refusing to look. Avery sat on a coil of rope, staring into the mist, thinking of the men who had gone down. He'd known some of them by face, none by name. War made friendship fleeting. It was easier that way. By the third day, the convoy reached the French coast. The beaches were still raw from battle. Cranes twisted, ships half sunk, the air heavy with the sour scent of burned fuel. Yet amid the wreckage, they unloaded. 20,000 tons of supplies, fuel, food, ammunition, spilled onto the sand like veins opening. Soldiers cheered as crates were hauled ashore. The system had worked. Barely. Avery watched from the deck as the shore grew solid again, dotted with tents and trucks and endless human motion. The sea behind him was calm now, pretending innocence. No one mentioned the tanker. No one dared. That night, as the convoy prepared to return to England, the wind carried faint sounds from the coast. Laughter, music from a makeshift radio, the clatter of mess tins. Somewhere inland, men were eating because of them. It didn't erase what had happened, but it gave it meaning. Avery lit a cigarette and leaned against the cold rail, watching the dark water ripple beneath the moon. "We're not heroes," he muttered to no one. "We're arteries," the ocean replied in silence. Only the steady thrum of the engines answered him. That deep, mechanical heartbeat that meant life continued, even when men did not. As dawn broke over the returning convoy, the sky glowed pink against the gray water. New ships joined their column, others peeled away. The system breathed, alive and relentless. It was ugly, mechanical, and magnificent all at once. A thing built not of compassion but necessity. And somehow it worked. The system worked. Barely. But what came next would push logistics into a form of warfare no one had imagined. By autumn of 1944, France was open. And starving. Roads once ruled by panzers were now veins feeding the Allied advance, but the arteries were clogged. The ports were jammed, the pipelines still too few, and the convoys from England could go no farther than the beaches. Beyond that, it was chaos. The war had turned into a race, and the fuel was running out. On the map, it looked simple. Paris had fallen, the front was pushing east. But each inch gained cost gallons the Allies didn't have. Tanks that had crushed the Wehrmacht now sat idle on dusty roads, their turrets drooping like wilted sunflowers. Patton's Third Army, hungry for pursuit, was choking on its own success. The enemy wasn't the Germans anymore. It was distance. In the command tents, tempers flared. "I can fight the Germans," Patton growled, "but I can't fight a gas shortage." The logisticians, those invisible soldiers of supply, stared at maps littered with pins, lines and numbers that no longer made sense. Rail lines were blown, bridges gone. The trucks they had weren't enough. They needed a miracle. Or at least 1,000 engines that never slept. And so the Red Ball Express was born. It began as an idea scrawled on a napkin, a closed loop of highways reserved solely for supply trucks, running day and night from the ports at Cherbourg to the front near Chartres. No civilians, no rest, no stop signs. Every truck carried food, fuel, or ammunition, and each mile was marked by exhaustion, danger, and determination. The drivers were mostly African-American soldiers, men relegated to service units, often unseen, often unthanked. But when the front demanded movement, the Army turned to them. They painted red circles on their trucks and helmets, the red ball, and began rolling. The film shifts tone. From solemn to kinetic. Engines roar. Tires scream. Dust clouds rise from broken French roads as hundreds of trucks surge forward in endless columns. The soundtrack becomes mechanical. Pistons, gears, the steady hum of diesel rhythm. A voiceover cuts through the roar. Every drop of gas, every bullet, every can of beans that reached the front. It came through these men. No headlines, no glory, just motion. They drove through rain, through darkness, through towns still smoldering from retreating Germans. The rules were simple: 24 hours on, 24 off, if you could find a place to sleep. Drivers dozed behind the wheel, cigarettes burning down to their lips, one hand on the wheel, one on the gear shift, eyes half open. Sometimes they drove with blackout lights so dim they could barely see the road. Trucks overturned in ditches, engines failed, but the line never stopped. Mechanics rode along fixing engines mid-route with wrenches and prayers. They called it the War of Movement, and the front was hungry for speed. But the Red Ball wasn't just a story of endurance. It was a story of injustice laid bare. The black soldiers who kept the Allied advance alive ate in separate mess tents, slept in segregated camps, and often faced hostility from the very men their fuel allowed to fight. One driver remembered being denied coffee at a French cafe, even as his truck idled outside carrying gasoline for Patton's tanks. Yet they drove on. In one scene, a convoy barrels through the night, headlights off, engines straining. Suddenly, tracers cut across the sky. A German fighter strafes the road, bullets sparking off hoods and asphalt. Trucks swerve, some jackknife, some burn, but the survivors keep driving. The line reforms, always forward. At dawn, the camera pans across a field littered with empty jerry cans, metallic bones of a new kind of warfare. The voiceover returns, quieter now. They said logistics wasn't glory. Maybe not. But glory doesn't move 350,000 gallons of fuel a day. By late autumn, the Red Ball Express was moving over 12,000 tons daily, the heartbeat of an army in motion. Without it, the offensive would have stalled. With it, the Allies reached the gates of Germany. Yet even among victory, the drivers remained invisible. When the medals were handed out, they weren't in the room. When the newspapers ran their headlines, no one printed the faces behind the wheel. Their war had no monuments, only miles. The scene fades to one driver, Private Eddie Brooks, sitting beside his truck at dusk. His hands are blackened with grease, his eyes bloodshot. The camera lingers as he lights a cigarette and watches the horizon, where the guns still thunder. "We keep them moving," he says softly. "That's enough." Engines rumble again. Trucks roll into the distance, disappearing into twilight. They were the silent cavalry of a mechanical age. Unseen, unthanked, unstoppable. Their courage wasn't measured in medals or battles, but in miles driven without sleep, in engines that refused to die. The war of movement was won not by tanks, but by men who refused to stop driving. But no system can run forever, and soon, the impossible convoy faced a threat it could never outrun. By December 1944, the machine that had fed a continent began to choke on its own success. The Allied front stretched from the English Channel to the Rhine. 1,000 miles of victory built on 1,000 small miracles of movement. But now, those miracles were failing. At the port of Antwerp, mountains of crates loomed like silent monuments to chaos. Food, ammunition, fuel, all there, all useless. The harbor cranes groaned day and night, but trucks were scarce, roads impassable. The autumn rains had turned France into a swamp, swallowing wheels and patience alike. The Red Ball convoys slowed to a crawl, and the ports that were meant to feed the front had become their own kind of battlefield. Everywhere, frustration. Dock workers cursed frozen winches. Drivers waited days for orders that never came. In the warehouses, rats feasted on chocolate meant for the Ardennes. From the air, the supply dumps looked like small cities. Thousands of tons of orderless abundance, waiting for someone to make sense of it. Inside the Allied command tents, sense was the rarest commodity of all. Patton wanted fuel to keep pushing east, convinced that one more drive could finish the war. Montgomery demanded priority for his northern offensive into the Low Countries. Bradley tried to arbitrate Eisenhower to keep the peace. But behind every strategic map was a moral question no one wanted to ask aloud. Whose men get to fight? And whose men starve waiting? The camera lingers on a single drum of gasoline. A painted stencil reads, U.S. Army, 5 gallons. 5 gallons that could carry one Sherman tank, another 2 miles, or cook 100 meals in a field kitchen. Somewhere, that choice mattered. Somewhere, it would kill. In the depots, tempers flared. Officers shouted over paperwork. Enlisted men fought over rumors. The carefully built rhythm of logistics, departure times, tonnage quotas, convoy manifests, began to unravel. A truck leaves Cherbourg bound for Liège. It never arrives. Another convoy disappears into fog, only to be found 3 days later stuck axle-deep in mud. Men sleep beside their engines, wrapped in blankets soaked with oil and despair. Efficiency, once their weapon, had become their enemy. One quartermaster wrote in his diary, "We are drowning in abundance. It's like watching a feast rot before hungry eyes." Cinematically, the tone shifts. The once crisp movements of the supply chain now dissolve into slow motion. Forklifts still, men stand idle. The soundtrack replaces the hum of engines with the distant rumble of artillery, as if the war itself is moving on, leaving its support behind. And yet, this was not just failure. It was entropy, the natural pull of war toward chaos. Every system, no matter how disciplined, eventually breaks under its own weight. The convoy that had fed 1 million men now teetered between order and collapse. The moral weight pressed hardest on the logisticians. Men trained to count, to plan, to predict. Now they faced a problem that couldn't be solved with numbers. They were no longer managing goods. They were managing consequences. At SHAEF headquarters, Eisenhower's staff worked around the clock. Maps were redrawn. Priority routes shifted daily. The phrase "controlled crisis" began appearing in reports, a polite way of saying barely held together. But beneath the surface, something darker brewed. The enemy had seen it too. German intelligence noted the stalled supply lines and the overextended front. And deep in the Ardennes, under the cover of winter fog, Hitler prepared a counterstroke, one aimed not at the Allied armies, but at their fragile arteries of fuel. For now the men at Antwerp didn't know it. They only knew that their world was shrinking, that control was slipping, that the machine was tired. The camera returns to the port. A soldier stands atop a crate, staring at the endless rows of supplies stretching to the horizon. Behind him a siren wails, an air raid alarm, faint and distant. He doesn't move. He just whispers, almost to himself, "We can't keep this up." The screen fades to black. The convoy system, the lifeline of the Western Front, was cracking under pressure. And in the middle of this breakdown, one man made a decision that would change the war's tempo once again. The crisis had pushed them to the edge of reason. When the ports clogged and the red ball slowed, the Allied advance began to suffocate. Armies that once stormed across France now stalled in place, engines silent, men waiting. It wasn't courage they lacked, it was octane. And when the front gasped for air, a handful of engineers decided to cheat physics itself. They called it the rolling pipeline. The idea sounded insane. If fuel couldn't reach the tanks fast enough, then the tankers would become the pipeline. A convoy of mobile fuel trucks linked together, moving, pumping, feeding one another in real time. A river of gasoline flowing across Europe on wheels. It began in a muddy field near Verdun, among engineers too sleep-deprived to know what they couldn't do. They scavenged hoses from damaged refueling depots, modified pressure valves from aircraft fuel systems, and rewired pumps designed for stationary use. The concept was simple in theory, suicidal in practice. Maintain a constant flow of gasoline between trucks while driving at 20 miles per hour through rain, mud, and artillery fire. One mistake, one spark, and the entire line would become a rolling firestorm. But the need was greater than the fear. The scene unfolds like a fever dream of invention. Men in oil-stained uniforms kneel beside a line of fuel trucks, adjusting valves by flashlight. Their breath steams in the cold. One engineer, Lieutenant Howard Mick Donnelly, sketches the pressure sequence in grease on the hood of a Jeep. If we can match pump speeds, he mutters, we can maintain flow without overpressure. The trucks feed each other, a moving artery. Around him, the others laugh nervously. It sounds like madness because it is. When the engines start, the ground trembles. Each tanker connects to the next with reinforced hoses, the couplings hissing as they lock into place. The first pump roars to life, a deep mechanical heartbeat. The second joins in, then the third, until the sound becomes a living pulse of synchronized motion. The pressure gauges climb, hoses swell. Somewhere inside the system, gasoline begins to move. Let's roll. The convoy creeps forward. 50 trucks, then 100, each feeding the next, the last pumping directly into waiting tankers bound for the front. The formation stretches for miles, a steel serpent glinting in the dawn. From above, it looks impossible. A moving fuel line that defies logic, speed, and safety. Drivers communicate with hand signals, their faces streaked with soot and adrenaline. The lead truck accelerates slightly, testing the system. Pressure drops. The engineers adjust on the fly, shouting through the din. Every valve, every rotation matters. A single misalignment could rupture the line, but it holds. For the first time in weeks, fuel flows without pause. The numbers are staggering. 90,000 gallons moved in a single day, then 120,000, then more. Tanks that were idle roar back to life. Patton's columns move again. The impossible convoy is no longer a metaphor. It's alive, humming, unstoppable. And yet the beauty of the system is matched only by its fragility. The convoy becomes its own ecosystem. Constant motion, constant risk. Each driver must hold formation exactly. Each pump must remain synchronized. They drive through bombed-out villages, past burning fields, through nights so black the headlights feel like defiance. One night, under artillery flashes, a coupling breaks. Fuel sprays across the road in a golden arc. For a moment everything freezes, no one breathes. Then a spark from a tailpipe ignites the vapor. The explosion is blinding. 3 trucks vanish in flame. The convoy doesn't stop. It can't. To stop is to die. The surviving trucks swerve, reform, reconnect. The engineers replace the lost link in motion. The river flows again. This is the logic of industrial war. Compassion deferred, progress paid for in fire. Word of the rolling pipeline spreads across the front. Other units copy the design, improving it, streamlining it. Pressure regulators are standardized, couplings redesigned to seal faster. Soon, the technique becomes doctrine. Mobile fuel relay. What began as desperation becomes innovation, taught in briefings and field manuals. To the soldiers on the ground, it seems like magic. Fuel arrives where it shouldn't. Tanks move that should have stayed still. But to the engineers, it's math, sweat, and will. A triumph of coordination over chaos. In one quiet moment, Donnelly watches the convoy roll past. Truck after truck, hoses glinting in moonlight. They said logistics was paperwork, he says softly. Tell that to the man who keeps the fire burning. The visual tone shifts again, from triumph to tension. The convoy moves into winter. Snow drifts across the roads, valves freeze, pumps seize. Men use torches to thaw metal, their faces illuminated by orange light. The system holds, but barely. Each mile feels borrowed, each gallon earned through sheer defiance. In headquarters reports, the phrase appears, continuous mobile refueling, operational success. No mention of the men who rode within inches of catastrophe, or the engineers who rebuilt physics with wrenches and faith. But the soldiers at the front knew. When their tanks surged forward once more, when their engines roared to life in places fuel should never have reached, they called it a miracle, the convoy that broke physics. It was genius born from exhaustion, invention forged in collapse. The system was reborn, but war was about to remind them that nothing man-made lasts forever. December 1944. Europe vanished beneath white silence. The roads that had once thundered with convoys were now buried under snow so deep it swallowed tires, muffled engines, and erased direction. What had been triumph only weeks earlier was now survival. The German counteroffensive, the Battle of the Bulge, struck like a hammer from the fog. Panzer divisions burst through the Ardennes, slicing supply lines, cutting off entire armies. What they couldn't destroy, the winter would. Temperatures fell below freezing. Fuel turned thick as syrup. Steel grew brittle enough to crack at touch. The convoy that once symbolized motion now fought simply to move an inch. From the air, the Allied lines looked strangled, long, thin veins of ice winding through a white wilderness. And somewhere in that frozen labyrinth, men waited for the convoy that could not fail. We see it through three pairs of eyes. First, Private Sam Turner, a Red Ball driver now running solo missions through blizzards. His truck is more coffin than vehicle, its windshield crusted with frost, his breath freezing on the steering wheel. The wipers barely move. The headlights are useless against the snowstorm. He drives by instinct, counting fence posts, reading the faint shadow of tire ruts. The road beneath him groans with ice. Behind, the trailer sloshes with gasoline, each turn a gamble with death. He hasn't slept in 36 hours. Somewhere ahead, an entire battalion is waiting for what's inside his tank. Every mile is a prayer. Every hill feels endless. Second, Captain Elaine Brooks, logistics officer at Bastogne, where the encircled 101st Airborne fights without resupply. Her office is a cellar under a shattered farmhouse, lit by one flickering lamp. Around her, crates of rations dwindle. Her logbook tells a story of subtraction, each page thinner than the last. She cuts allocations again. Half rations, then quarter rations. She counts fuel barrels with the same care priests count communion wafers. Outside, artillery rolls like distant thunder. "We can't eat maps," one soldier tells her. She doesn't answer. Third, Sergeant Michael Kraus, a rifleman in the snowbound forest. His canteen is frozen solid. His hands bleed from the cold. He stares at his last tin of beans, wondering whether to eat it or save it for tomorrow. The men joke less now. The war feels smaller, reduced to inches of warmth, to hunger and hope. In the silence between bombardments, he can almost hear engines far away, the faint hum of salvation crawling through the snow. These three threads weave into one truth. Logistics has become life itself. Outside Bastogne, Turner's truck finally appears. Headlights dim, engine coughing, body shaking from cold. He's down to his last drop of fuel but refuses to stop. The convoy is gone. He's alone, the last link in a chain that once spanned continents. The snow blinds him. The road vanishes beneath. When he finally sees the faint outline of American helmets through the white, he smiles, not in joy but relief so deep it hurts. He's made it. Behind him, the horizon flickers, German artillery finding its mark. Shells bloom in the distance, orange fire against the endless white. He accelerates anyway. Brooks meets him at the edge of town. The pump hose freezes solid in her hands and she thaws it with her breath. Together, they drain every drop. The gasoline smells like life itself. By nightfall, the 101st can light their stoves again, warm their rifles, and keep fighting. Somewhere in the line, Kraus feels heat for the first time in days. He doesn't know where it came from, only that it arrived, quietly, like a miracle. The camera lingers on the convoy's aftermath, trucks buried in snowdrifts, engines seized, men sleeping inside them for warmth. Their faces are ghost pale, their eyes empty from exhaustion. Out there, amid the cold and the fire, logistics stopped being numbers. It became human. Breath, hunger, motion against paralysis. The convoy didn't just feed armies. It kept their hearts beating. In one haunting image, dawn breaks over a field of frozen trucks. The rising sun glints off frost-coated hoods, turning the convoy into a graveyard of glass. The war machine has paused, caught in ice, but not dead. By January, the thaw begins. The German offensive collapses. The convoys start again, slower, wiser, carrying not just fuel but memory. For the survivors, the war has changed shape. It's no longer about who wins or loses. It's about endurance, about refusing to let the cold erase what they built. When the snow cleared, The convoy was still rolling, but it had left something behind in the ice. Spring 1945 arrived over Germany with the quiet inevitability of history itself. The front lines, once jagged and fragile, now surged forward with tanks, trucks, and men fed by the convoy system that had once seemed impossible. Rivers of fuel coursed through open roads, supplies filled depots, and artillery fired without pause. The machinery of war, once dependent on luck, improvisation, and heroism, now moved on the rhythm of logistics. From the vantage of command, the lesson was clear. The war had been won as much by planning as by bullets. In reconstructed briefings, generals emphasized the invisible backbone of victory. Maps traced convoy routes like arteries. Tonnage charts became strategic weapons. Every advance, every captured town, every liberated village had depended on systems built far from the front, where men and machines moved with meticulous precision. Archival voiceovers underscore the shift. The lesson was simple yet profound, one officer recounts. An army marches on its stomach, but it advances on its logistics. Historians today see this moment as the birth of modern military supply doctrine. NATO planners, Cold War strategists, and contemporary logistics corps all tracing their methods to the ingenuity of the rolling pipeline and the Red Ball Express. The human element remains central. Engineers who synchronized pumps, drivers who defied ice and fatigue, officers who calculated every mile. They all shaped doctrine without ever holding a medal. Their names rarely appear in histories of combat, but their work persists in every resupply plan, every operational schedule, every lesson taught in military academies. Discipline, rhythm, and relentless motion became the new canon, proving that warfare is as much about infrastructure as it is about courage. Contrasts emerge naturally. The destruction of Europe, once molten and chaotic, is now organized into grids and supply chains. The ruins of railways, bombed bridges, and ruined ports are replaced in memory by precision. Tons moved, miles covered, soldiers sustained. War, which once seemed random and cruel, yields to structure, not by erasing risk, but by mitigating it through planning and foresight. Veterans recall the difference. One driver reflects on the endless miles of the Red Ball Express. "We weren't in the headlines. We weren't in the pictures. But without us, the Army stopped. That's what mattered." Engineers echo similar pride, noting that their calculations and designs ensured survival in ways rifles never could. It was a war fought with wrenches and hoses, with maps and timing, as much as with shells and steel. Doctrine became living memory. Manuals codified procedures. Simulations trained new generations. Yet beneath the instructional diagrams lies something intangible: the faith in systems, the trust in men to execute them, and the courage to innovate under fire. These lessons extend beyond combat. They are lessons in human perseverance, ingenuity, and the quiet heroism of those who operate in the shadows of history. As Allied columns roll into Berlin and Hamburg, the camera pans across moving highways, refueled tanks, and supply convoys threading through liberated cities. Victory is visible not just in flags or captured ground, but in the order that overlays chaos. The machinery of war, disciplined and disciplined again, moves like a living organism, feeding itself and the soldiers who depend on it. And yet, as reverent as doctrine can be, it is not enough to capture the full measure of the effort. The manuals, charts, and procedures preserve efficiency, but they cannot preserve fear, exhaustion, courage, or cold nights spent beside frozen engines. Those human truths, the faces, the fatigue, the improvisation, remain elusive, yet essential. The war taught that logistics could win battles, but memory preserves the soul of those victories. Systems may endure, but human experience defines them. But the real legacy wasn't written in doctrine. It was written in memory. Thomas Avery stood at the edge of a modern pier, the December wind cold against his face but softened by decades of memory. Container ships glided past like steel leviathans, each carrying the echoes of the same purpose he had once served: feeding armies, sustaining lives, keeping a continent in motion. He watched the cranes swing gracefully, their movements precise and silent, and thought of the chaos he had once navigated: the fire, the snow, the fear. The sea had not changed, only the tools. He remembered the convoy, the Empire halberd, the tanker fires, the night blizzards, the rolling fuel lines. Faces of men who slept on frozen decks flashed behind his eyes, each a heartbeat in a machine that had carried millions forward. They were young then, terrified yet resolute, unaware that their labor would become the backbone of modern warfare, yet fueled by the simplest, most human of instincts: to move, to survive, to protect one another. The memorial beside him bore no names, only a plaque acknowledging the thousands who served in silence. He traced the letters with a gloved hand, thinking of comrades lost to ice, fire, and the merciless logic of supply. Their courage had been quiet, their heroism mechanical, yet profound. He could still hear the engines thrum, the pumps hiss, the wind howl through the rigging. That sound had been the heartbeat of survival. Avery turned to the water, seeing each ship as a living convoy, a testament to ingenuity and endurance. Systems could be designed, pumps synchronized, schedules calculated, but all of it depended on hands, eyes, and hearts willing to see a mission through, no matter the risk. War might be measured in artillery, tanks, and territory, but survival depended on motion, trust, and perseverance. He thought of the soldiers in Bastogne, of red ball drivers pounding endless miles, of engineers who bent physics to human need. They had fed not just armies, but hope itself. And in doing so, they had transformed logistics into a moral act, a living proof that human determination could impose order on chaos, that cooperation could outmatch destruction. The sea reflected the gray sky, calm now, as if honoring the countless journeys of the past. Avery remembered a lesson learned decades ago. Every mile mattered. Every decision carried weight beyond the immediate. Life and death were measured not in grand maneuvers alone, but in the steady flow of resources, in the quiet dedication of those unseen. Machinery without humanity was impotent. Humanity without machinery would exhaust itself. Together they became unstoppable. He allowed himself a small, private smile. The war had demanded cruelty, but it had also revealed the capacity for brilliance, for invention, and for endurance. Systems built for destruction had become vessels of life. A convoy, properly orchestrated, could feed millions, prevent starvation, and tip the scales of history. Yet behind every successful mile were men who had risked everything without recognition. Avery exhaled, watching the modern ships move in silent procession. The engines were different, the materials advanced, the scale enormous, but the principle remained the same. Motion sustained life. He thought of the lessons etched in mud, ice, and fire decades ago, now encoded in doctrine, manuals, and memory. The moral freight had not disappeared. It had been preserved in every calculation, every truck, every ship that continued to carry the weight of human necessity across water and land. He closed his eyes, recalling the roar of the convoy, the hiss of pumps, the faces of men who had trusted motion over fear. In that rhythm, he understood the truth. War could destroy, but it could also illuminate human ingenuity, cooperation, and endurance. Victory depended as much on these hands and hearts as it did on rifles and tanks. When he opened his eyes, the horizon was a ribbon of steel and water, quiet yet alive. The ships moved steadily, unwavering. Avery felt the weight of memory and the lightness of completion. The convoys had moved, and in moving they had shaped history, sustained nations, and preserved life amid chaos. In the end, the war was won not by the armies that advanced, but by the convoys that never stopped.